Good afternoon. We're going to continue our conversations on South Carolina history. We've gotten through Ben Tillman, finally. We've gotten through South Carolina's beginning of the New South with the industrialization, particularly textile mills upstate. And now we're going to look at South Carolina at war and the years after the war between World War I and World War II. Let's go ahead and get South Carolina into the war. South Carolinians had very early on supported Woodrow Wilson's candidacy for the White House. Among his strongest backers were the Gonzalez brothers of the state newspaper and other Carolina progressives. They claimed him as one of our own. And but what they meant by that was Wilson's father had been a professor at Columbia Theological Seminary. That's now the Robert Mills House. That was the old Columbia Theological Seminary. And his mother's family, the Woodrows, still lived in Columbia. Woodrow Wilson spent his formative years in the house on Hampton Street, which is operated now by Historic Columbia as a historic home, Woodrow Wilson's childhood home. And then he left Columbia for Davidson. He only lasted 1 year. The rumor is he didn't get the fraternity bid that he wanted, so he went to Princeton. At least that's the story. The Davidson of the North. He was president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and when he was running for president in 1912, the Republicans were divided. Teddy Roosevelt had thought he could get the nomination over his friend William Howard Taft, but it didn't work out, so he formed a third party, the Bull Moose Party, and you had Woodrow Wilson running as a Democrat, Teddy Roosevelt running as a Bull Moose, and President Taft, the incumbent, running as a Republican. Wilson won an overwhelming victory in the Electoral College, and his victory brought Democrats back into power after 50 years of political wilderness. He named Narcisco Gonzalez as minister or ambassador to Cuba, and then later as ambassador to Peru. Asbury F. Lever of Lexington County became chairman of the House Agricultural Committee, an extremely important position. He was co-author of the Smith-Lever Act that established funding for the county agent program, which still exists today. We can trace all of that back to Mr. Lever from Lexington County. He also got Woodrow Wilson to modify the Farm Loan Act of 1916 to create 12 regional federal farm loan banks, one of which was, of course, located here in Columbia. The 1916 election, Wilson's running for re-election. The Republicans are unified, and Wilson ran on the slogan of "He kept us out of war," because Europe, of course, had disintegrated into the horrors of World War I. Months, just several months after he was inaugurated, actually weeks after he was inaugurated, because it was March in those days, not January, the U.S. entered World War I, following the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, South Carolinians were not unified in joining the Allies, and you have to understand that. From our very first conversations, we talked about population and demographics making a difference. Well, South Carolina had large pockets of German population who obviously were not part of the Allies. There were also large pockets of Irish population, particularly in Charleston and Columbia, and the Irish hated the English and did not want to join in the war. So you're looking at the old German settlement areas, Newberry, Lexington, Orangeburg, as being anti-British, or at least maybe even pro-German, and Charleston County as being anti-British. 1 week before the United States entered the war, there was a preparedness parade in Columbia, prepare to, join the Allies and what have you. And an anti-war rally in Lexington the same day. Coleman Blease, who had been governor, was anti-war. The government closed down several newspapers in the state because of their anti-Allies position. And many Carolinians of German descent began to mask their cultural heritage as dachshunds became liberty pups, sauerkraut became liberty cabbage, and the playing of Beethoven and Bach was considered unpatriotic. There were German languages schools in Charleston, and they closed. And in many rural churches, particularly in Newberry, Lexington, and Orangeburg counties, Lutheran pastors were expected to give at least one sermon a year in German. All of that stopped with the war. Governor Richard I. Manning, and you remember I earlier described him as the best governor of the state has ever had, appointed a state council of defense. Now, of course, you're dealing with two South Carolinas. You've got a white South Carolina, and now you've got, which is still, by the way, the minority population in 1916. And then you've got black Carolina. So all war efforts were segregated. Red Cross drives, bond drives, victory gardens, victory parades. Patriotic funds raised in today's money more than $1 billion. And on a per capita basis, South Carolina had one of the highest participation rates in the country. For the first time since before 1860, white South Carolinians began to celebrate the 4th of July. Black Carolinians had celebrated it since 1865. Military bases sprang up around Columbia, Fort Jackson, Spartanburg, Camp Wadsworth, and Camp Sevier outside Greenville. Parris Island and the Charleston Navy Yard became quite busy, and there were fuel and food shortages. You know, we all hear a lot of grumbling about, well, why can't we have this today and we can't have that? Why isn't this on the menu? You know, this has been going on since March. Our forebears in World War I were a little bit stern of stuff. When I say fuel shortages and food shortages, that's exactly what I mean. Mondays became heatless days. That meant you couldn't buy, or you weren't supposed to use coal or wood. And stores and mills closed, and you weren't paid when the stores or mills closed. There was no PPE program to take care of that. Of the 79 Medals of Honor awarded during World War I, 7 went to South Carolinians. Now just think about that. Basically 10% of the Medals of Honor went to a very small state, including Lieutenant James Dozier of Rock Hill, who eventually would become Adjutant General of South Carolina right after the war and remained as Adjutant General until the 1950s. And Captain Freddie Stowers of Sandy Springs, who was the only black soldier to receive the Medal of Honor in either war. Now, the war had a definite impact on the economy. In 1910, South Carolina was the smallest of the cotton-producing states, but the 3rd largest producer of cotton behind Texas and Georgia. In 1914, cotton prices were high, and then came the war. The export markets disappeared. Cotton exchanges across the South closed for 3 months. Governor Blease, who in the years just before the war, created with the General Assembly a system of state cotton warehouses that control the storing, grading, and marketing of the crop. And farmers got deposit certificates for their stored cotton. And probably was illegal, but General Assembly said that banks and businesses had to accept certificates instead of cash on loans for repayment of loans. The General Assembly passed a law forbidding farmers from planting more than 1/3 the acreage they had planted in 1914 of any crop. Now just, again, this is South Carolina where, you know, the government doesn't get in anybody's way. But they're telling you as a farmer that you can't plant more than a third of the acreage that you planted last year. Now, that may be fine for a large landowner who's got 1,000 acres, but what about the farmer who's got 50 acres, basically a subsistence crop, and he can only plant a third of that? Of course, what this did was reduce the amount of cotton on the market, and prices began to rise slowly. And then, once the United States entered the war, cotton prices went through the roof. Everybody made money: landowners, merchants, bankers, tenants, even sharecroppers. And cotton acreage was expanded for the first time in living memory. And that's what we get from folks who did some memoirs that are in the Caroliniana and elsewhere. They said in 1917, 1918, for the first time in living memory, we had cash in their pockets. And they went on a perfect orgy of spending. They bought machinery, built new barns, a new house, consumer goods, automobiles. The end of the war did not mean an end to high cotton prices, at least not at first. And then came the armistice. It was celebrated wildly in cities across the state. Black servicemen who had fought to make the world safe for democracy expected their country to live up to that slogan, but it didn't happen. President Wilson had ordered federal offices segregated. They had been integrated since the 1860s. In January 1919, a statewide Negro convention protested against voting barriers and petitioned for better roads and schools. There was a horrible race riot in Charleston in May 1919. Sailors from the Navy ships went on a rampage through the black districts of Charleston. And Congressman James F. Burns said, "The war has in no way changed the attitude of the white man towards the social and political equality of the Negro." There was something called the South Carolina Constructive League of white South Carolinians that had the aim to promote the just treatment of the Negro and the cultivation of harmony between the races, so long as it was understood that the state shall be dominated by its white citizens. This strange organization faded with the end of racial tensions in late 1919. By 1920, most Americans and even South Carolinians, especially South Carolinians, were tired of progressivism and ready to live it up. But Carolinians were a little bit out of step. 1920 was actually the high tide of progressivism in South Carolina. With the election of Governor Robert A. Cooper, he had a great plan for roads and schools. He ran unopposed in the primary on a platform of increasing taxes to improve education, public health, and highways. And just think of that. Then, between 1919 and 1920, tobacco prices dropped 50%. In 1921, cotton prices were above 40 cents a pound in June. Then they began a precipitous decline, and by December had fallen to 13.5 cents a pound. The Commissioner of Agriculture estimated that farmers spent, and these are in today's dollars, $3.2 billion to plant a crop that brought them collectively only $1.83 billion, half of what they had put in. Sagging farm prices marked the beginning of a rural depression that affected the entire state. Everybody talks about the stock market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression. Folks, the Great Depression began in South Carolina in 1919, 1920, particularly 1920. And textiles were affected as well. War had produced tremendous demand and even greater profits, and local owners had sold their textile mills to northern firms at inflated prices. After the war, production continued to expand. There was lower demand and markets, and so lower prices. And what happens at the mills? First of all, work weeks were reduced. Employees became part-time instead of full-time. Mills closed for weeks at a time. And again, when the mill closes for a week, nobody's getting a paycheck. If you're a part-time employee, you're only getting paid per hour, not a weekly wage. All of these measures reduce paychecks, and some companies resorted to what was called the speed up and stretch out. This meant they would speed up the number of the rate that the looms operated, make them go faster back and forth. And the stretch out was normally an operative was responsible for X number of looms. This was sometimes increased 10, 15, even 30%. And so you were expected to run back and forth and do more, and it was dangerous. Tending the looms was a dangerous job, where many a person lost their fingers. Of course, for a reduced salary. And it's interesting that these terrible working conditions, for the most part, took place in the mills that were owned by Northern interests, not those that were locally owned. There was labor unrest in the 1920s. It was generally resolved at plants that were owned by South Carolinians, but not by those from outside forces. In 1921 and 1929, the South Carolina House of Representatives condemned the actions by textile management of introducing the stretch out and the speed up. After the war, production at the Charleston Navy Yard was reduced to only 500 people employed. In 1920, 1/3 of the women in South Carolina were working outside the home. Now that percentage is swelled by the proportion of African American women who are working outside the home. But also a number of white women had gone to work during the war, and they stayed on the job after the war. When I grew up in the 1950s, being a secretary, that was a woman's job. Before World War I, clerks, that was a man's job. The same thing with school teaching. Everybody thinks about the school barn. Not in the better schools, it was men. And of course, the teaching profession became overwhelmingly female during the war and remained that way. Even to the present day, it's still a majority female occupation. The Roaring '20s. Now, while the rest of the country was partying, South Carolinians struggled to cope with economic distress and modernization. The 18th Amendment brought prohibition, but it was a failure here just like it was everywhere else. Charleston, according to the News and Courier, was ringing, sopping, dripping wet throughout the decade. Local officials took payoffs. The News and Courier complained that prohibition had ruined Charlestonians' tastes, that instead of port and Madeira, they drank hellhole swamp corn. The illegal liquor trade, moonshining, rum running, and bootlegging employed between 25 and 40,000 residents. Now, just think about our coastline. All of those creeks, all of those inlets, rum was coming in from Cuba, from Bermuda. It was very easy to get in. And of course, moonshine was a big deal. A pint of moonshine in Greenville County in today's dollars cost you $34.46. Now that was expensive stuff. Only the good Lord knows what it was made of, and I guess you might be lucky that you didn't go blind or die. And that's not just an exaggeration, folks. A lot of people died from getting bad moonshine, not just in South Carolina, everywhere. Governor John G. Richards wanted to put South Carolina on a pedestal. He said, we will become a beacon of virtue to the other 47 states. He strictly enforced the blue laws, including invading golf courses in Aiken and arresting Sunday golfers. also golfers in Camden and Charleston. He twice vetoed efforts by the General Assembly to loosen the blue laws, and that was, the laws affecting what goes on Sundays, which a majority of South Carolinians wanted to happen. And in many ways, you get a reaction to contemporary morality. Kind of strange things. In Greenville, a couple was fined, and again today's dollars, $144 for kissing while in an automobile on a public street. A Saluda County judge declared that swimming pools were the tools of the devil and should be closed. Fundamentalists and evangelicals attacked the curriculum in high schools and colleges, and there were especially nasty fights about what was being taught at Furman. And yet, 2 years after the famous Scopes trial in Tennessee, the General Assembly of South Carolina rejected an effort to ban the teaching of evolution in the public schools. Upstate churches joined hands with the Klan to protect the state's white population from moral corruption, Jews, blacks, and Roman Catholics. Local Baptist clergy publicly addressed Klan rallies in the upstate, and politicians at all levels joined, and most made no secret of their membership. Speaker of the House of Representatives of South Carolina, John K. Hamlin of Union, hosted a barbecue in Columbia at the Klan's state headquarters. Interestingly, Congressman Jimmy Burns refused to join the Klan. The state's economic distress contributed to an overall sense of unease. A few folks had made money during the flush years between 1917 and 1920. One of the people who was an exception, and it's a wonderful family story, and it's true, Edgar R. Rembert of Rembert demanded and got gold for his 1920 cotton crop, and that was when it was over 40 cents a pound. And he made the brokers pay him in gold. He got it, put it in the bank, and he never farmed again. He lived off that cotton crop. He didn't buy new cars. He put the money away. Now, there are reasons for the economic decline, because remember, we hadn't gotten to the stock market crash yet. Overproduction of cotton and tobacco. The loss of overseas markets after the war. Europe was poor. They couldn't pay for textiles or anything else. Most of what we exported was either tobacco or textiles. A series of droughts, horrible droughts in the early 1920s, about 4 years in a row. And then we've got the boll weevil. Now think about this whammy. You've got a drop in prices, you've got drought, you've got the boll weevil. In 1921, the boll weevil wiped out the Sea Island crop, Sea Island cotton, the finest cotton in the world, grown in certain areas of the Low Country, and it never recovered. It joined indigo and rice in the state's agricultural history in that song. In 1922, the boll weevil hit upland cotton with a vengeance. In some years of the decade, 50% of any crop that was planted was lost. And some people were worse off. In 1920, Williamsburg County farmers produced 37,000 bales of cotton. But in 1922, they only marketed 2,700. That's a decline of 93%. Just saying, 93%. In 1921, 1921, a McCormick County farmer produced 65 bales. The next year, only 6. So again, a 90% reduction. Between 1910 and 1920, the state's average cotton production had been about 1.4 million bales. During the 1920s, it declined 42% to about 800,000. By 1930, the state's agricultural sector was teetering on the brink of total collapse. Farm buildings and land had lost 1/2 their value. 1/3 of all the state's farms were mortgaged. 70% of all farmers survived only on borrowed money. And farming on marginal lands and poor agricultural practices led to severe soil erosion. In 1934, 8 of the 19 million acres of farmland under cultivation in South Carolina, that's about 40%, were declared to be destroyed, not worth farming. And Fairfield County became the most seriously eroded county in the United States of America. Now, what kind of impact did that have on everybody? In 1935, the state's population was 3 times what it had been in 1850, but produced only the same amount of food crops. Okay, so that meant food had to be imported into an agricultural state, and that was expensive. There was a chant at mills, 10-cent cotton and 40-cent meat, how in the hell can a poor man eat? And then, because of poor nutrition, disease, notably pellagra, swept rural and mill town communities. And so what did South Carolinians do? By the thousands, they picked up and left. After the disastrous harvest of 1922, some 50,000 black South Carolinians fled, and tens of thousands of white Carolinians followed suit. During the decade of the 20s, 24 of our 46 counties lost population, some as much as 15%. And it might be no surprise, they're still in trouble today. Abbeville, Allendale, Edgefield, McCormick, and Saluda. Black Carolinians went north following the railroads. In 1930, more South Carolinians in exile were living in Buffalo, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Pittsburgh than in Abbeville, Beaufort, Bennettsville, Conway, or Lancaster. White Carolinians went south and west, to Florida, to Georgia, to Texas, and all the way to California. By World War II, nearly 1/4 of all Americans who registered in the census that they had been born in South Carolina lived in another state. And just think about it. 1/4 during that decade between the wars left South Carolina for somewhere else. The consequences of outmigration. You lose a lot of talent and resources because frequently it's the young folks who are getting up and going. But those who remained created a very interesting dichotomy in the population. You have the older folks, but those younger ones who remained tended to have large families, black or white. In fact, South Carolina had the youngest median age in the U.S. on the eve of World War II. And in 1922, the state had a white majority for the first time since 1820, a fact that was publicized in brochures attracting folks to come to South Carolina. And I think at that point, I'll sign off for today, and we'll pick up this conversation because what happened in South Carolina between the wars, I'm not quite there, but I know there's some of us out here who can remember that, or they can remember the stories of their parents and grandparents. So next week we'll continue South Carolina between the wars.